Morning folks, I'm Dave Canterbury with Reliance Outfitters. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start a series of videos that talks through some of the products that we carry at Reliance Outfitters, how they were developed, and a little bit of their history and why and how we use them in a bushcraft, survival, camping, hunting, trail hiking type environment, okay? And the first one I want to cover is the Pathfinder HD6 Ferrocerium Rod. So I want to talk a little bit about Ferrocerium rods, talk a little bit about how they work, talk a little bit about how to use them, and why I think this is the best ferro rod and striker combination on the market today. Stay with me. Okay, so let's talk about this Ferrocerium rod out of the package, this HD6. The 6 stands for a 6-inch long rod. It's 3/8 inch in diameter. It has a tungsten steel striker with a large grip handle on it for striking, and it's attached by stretch cord. The striker is the key element to this rod other than the material makeup and hardness versus softness of the rod that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, what is a ferro rod and why do we even carry one? Well, a ferrocerium rod basically is a mixture of metals that are all considered what's called pyrophoric. And basically what that means in simple terminology is that when you scrape material from this rod, it will spontaneously combust, giving you sparks. The sparks from this ferrocerium rod are approximately 3,500 degrees. So to put that in perspective, the sparks from something like a flint and steel set where you're striking rock against a steel to throw sparks, those sparks are about 800 degrees, which is combustion temperature. So these are 4 times normal combustion temperature when they leave this rod. So why carry this rod if we can carry something like open flame in a cigarette lighter very simply in our pocket? The answer to that is this is an emergency tool. It's not something that you start every single fire with. Under conditions where it's very, very wet and damp, this rod is completely waterproof. You can submerge it underwater, pull it out, and it will immediately strike spark. Along with the fact that the rod is made of a metal that's long lasting because you're not going to remove a ton of this material at a time. It's a very thin veneer that you're taking off of here. So the longevity of this rod will far outlast something like a cigarette lighter. So this is a much better option for a secondary fire starting method where you may be trying to conserve a resource with the fluid in the smaller ferrocerium rod within that cigarette lighter. And that's one of the great reasons to carry something like this. It's also not affected by wind like open flame is, where a lighter may blow out. So there's several reasons to carry one of these, but understanding that it's truly an emergency resource and not something we use every single day necessarily unless we're practicing is important. So now let's discuss for a minute how a ferrocerium rod works. We talked about it being made from pyrophoric materials. So the pretense of this rod is that we take some type of striking device, whether it be the one that comes with the rod or something like the 90-degree spine of our belt knife, and we scrape along the length of the rod to remove material which will be sparking when it comes off the rod at approximately 3,500 degrees. Now, the key to that whole thing is you have to remove material from the rod. So that's why I want to kind of discuss with you a little bit about the rod itself and the striker. The harder this striker is in comparison to the metal this rod's made out of, the more material you can remove at one time. The longer this rod is and the larger the diameter is, once it becomes flattened out somewhat, the more surface area you're in contact with for more contact time, which allows you to remove or put more of that molten sparking metal material inside your tinder source to help you affect fire. So you don't need to get ridiculous. The rod doesn't need to be 12 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. But at the same time, a smaller rod will give you a much lesser effect to make fire than something like this 6-inch rod will. Some of that will have to do with the tinder source itself and the combustibility level of that tinder source. If you have a tinder source that has a natural accelerant or a chemical accelerant built into it, like fatwood or mini inferno from Reliance Outfitters, then it doesn't take near as much from this rod to be able to light that material. And so a smaller rod would work very, very well in that situation. However, you can't guarantee that you're always going to be in that situation. Something like this aspen bark, on the other hand, that doesn't have an accelerant in it, that you are only relying on the capability to combust the finer portions of this material once you process it down, may not combust near as easily with a few sparks as with a mass amount of sparks into that tinder bundle or that bird nest of material. So let's talk about striking this rod and show you what that's supposed to look like before we talk about using different tinder sources, accelerant and non-accelerant tinder sources. All of these rods are going to have a dark black coating on them when you get the rod, and that's to keep the metal underneath from oxidizing. So you're going to have to remove that material with the striking device first to get that clean metal look on the rod. And you can see where I've removed that material. Once you do that, it's going to throw sparks. You see those sparks burning after the fact, okay? Those are what we're looking for. I'm putting barely any pressure on this rod whatsoever. I can do that with 2 fingers, just pushing down, because this is made from tungsten steel. What you need to realize is on this striker, you have a flat edge, and that's not what you're striking with. You're striking with the corner of that edge. You're tilting that striker from the flat down to the corner, and then you are running it down the rod, just like this, or you are pulling the rod back away from the striking device like this. And this will allow you to direct and aim sparks. But you can also put this tinder device in front of you and aim the sparks by placing the rod close and pushing down. The problem you run into is exactly what you're seeing here, where I'm overrunning the rod and I could run into my tinder source. However, if you've got something laying there and you can just come into it like this and stop a little bit short, and when I do that, I just turn the striker. So I'm just kind of going this way and turning the striker up so it stops short. And now I'm not knocking my tinder source around, but I'm also not really creating a speed bump right here either, where I haven't had even pressure along the rod. You can also use your knife for this same thing. So if you've got a knife with a good 90-degree spine on it, you can do the same thing. You'll get a lot of leverage on that knife to be able to do that, to be able to come down on that and push down. And again, I'm not pushing down very hard to get those sparks. However, the reason we developed this tungsten striker with this large grip on it is because you can get enough leverage with this softer rod. And that's the key to this, is how much material you remove from this rod with a single strike. The harder this rod is, the more difficult it is to remove material. And because this is an emergency device, I don't want that difficulty. I'll throw this thing away after I use it in an emergency if I have to and buy a brand new one. It's like $20 or $25. That's a cheap insurance policy. If I'm gonna use it every day, it's not gonna matter. I'll just keep using it till I use it up. The key to this striker is that it doesn't take a whole lot of pressure in combination with this softer rod to actually push sparks off. Now, if I want molten material for stubborn tinder sources or something that may be marginal damp or not processed as fine, then I can actually bear down on this rod and push. And I'm gonna get sparks that are burning on the stump after the fact. Those are the ones that you want if you're trying to ignite a stubborn tinder source or something without an accelerant. If you've got an accelerant in your tinder source, and we'll use Mini Inferno as an example here, Mini Inferno is impregnated with an accelerant. So I've got just a quarter of one or a half of one here, and I just break it open to expose those small fibers. And because I know there's an accelerant there, I can barely hit this rod, it's gonna go up. Now I can do that same action with something else. We'll put this out. We'll grab some of this aspen bark here real quick. We'll just grab us a good bundle of it in our hand. We'll process it a little bit. And we won't use a lot of this for this demonstration. We'll just use a chunk, because I want you to understand the difference in the way you're going to strike this rod to get different results. So if we take this and we process it down to expose the fine fibers, and again, aspen bark is pretty coarse tinder material. So you can process it down fairly fine, but it's still going to be coarse in general, all right? So I put that in the same place, and I put my rod on there. And again, I'm gonna turn my rod until I've got that area where the coating is already removed. And I bury that in the tinder source and do the same thing. and I just barely touch down on throw sparks. It's not igniting that tinder. But as soon as I pin it down and lay on top of it hard and push down hard, now it's got burning material inside there that will catch flame. Okay? So that's the difference between striking it with a lot of force, pushing down into the rod and scraping mass amounts of material off that will burn here, and just scraping the rod. Okay? If I have an accelerant-based tinder like Pine Sap or like Mini Inferno, Tinder Quicks, anything like that, I can get away with those dainty strikes because the accelerant will combust. If I don't have accelerant on there, then I'm gonna have to lay on that bad boy to get those heavy-duty sparks. Or I'm going to have to take my knife with that rod, come up above that material and pull the rod away from the knife to put those heavy sparks inside there. And I can do that either way. It just depends on the situation. What I would tell you is you can get a lot of leverage with your knife on that Ferrocerium rod. Don't worry about that coloring, it'll come right off. You can get a lot of leverage against that rod up here on the edge of that knife. You don't get as much leverage with this. So again, if I've got a tinder source that I'm pretty sure I can light easily enough with this striker, there's no sense in using my belt knife. However, if I have a pile of tinder that may be very difficult and I want a massive amount of molten sparks in there off this rod, the max amount of material I can remove at one time, I want the most leverage I can get, pushing down and pulling up at the same time to remove lots of material off of that rod. You can see I'm burning stuff that's laying on the stump still with that, okay? So those are the differences between this striker and a knife. So for me, this HD6 is the perfect combination. You have something that you don't have to press on very hard to remove sparks off this rod. That's advantageous. If you're injured, if you're doing it with your offhand because this hand's injured, if you're older, if you are younger, all of those things affect how much downward pressure you can get on this thing and how well you can strike sparks off of it. So this striker being tungsten steel with a good 90-degree edge allows you to not have to hit this rod very hard and still remove good material off this rod, or bear down on it and really get the stuff off of it that's going to light stubborn tinder. That's the advantage to the HD6 Ferro Rod. All right, guys, listen, I'm Dave Canterbury from Reliance Outfitters. I appreciate you joining me today for this quick video on the HD6 Ferro Rod. I will follow this up with other videos on products from our website, how they were designed, how they were developed, why I think they're the best on the market, and how to properly use them in a wilderness setting or out in the woods camping. I appreciate your views and I appreciate your support. We thank you for everything you do for our business, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I can, guys. Thanks.